The gun was already drawn when Anna Rhodes walked through the door of the Redemption Creek Marshal's office, and the man behind the desk did not so much as flinch. She had not planned to pull it. That was the honest truth of it, the kind of truth she rarely allowed herself anymore. But 3 days of riding hard across the New Mexico territory with a bounty on her head and a secret burning a hole through her chest had stripped away most of her careful planning. What remained was instinct, and instinct said, "Draw first, talk second, run if there is a third option." The marshal looked up from the wanted poster spread across his desk, and his dark eyes moved from the barrel of her Colt revolver to her face with the calm, unhurried manner of a man who had made his peace with dangerous things a long time ago. He was broad in the shoulder and lean in the jaw, with a martial star pinned to a vest that had seen better years. He was younger than she expected. Not young exactly, but younger than the reputation that had traveled ahead of him all the way from Amarillo to the Rio Grande. "You going to shoot me?" he asked. His voice was steady. Not brave steady, the kind men put on when they were scared and trying to hide it. Genuinely steady, the way still water is steady. Anna's grip did not loosen. "That depends entirely on what you do next." "Fair enough." He set down the wanted poster slowly, face up, so she could see it from across the room. It was her face staring back at her from that yellowed paper. The name printed beneath the crude illustration read, "Anna Rhodes." Below that, "Wanted, dead or alive. Reward $800. Her jaw tightened. $800. It had gone up again. "You've been following me," she said. It was not a question. "You've been riding a straight line toward my town for 2 days, he replied. "I didn't need to follow you, I just waited." He leaned back in his chair with his hands flat on the desk where she could see them, and he had the audacity, the absolute audacity, to look almost comfortable. "My name is David Sawyer. I'm the Marshal of Redemption Creek. And you, unless that poster is a lie, are Anna Rhodes." She should have run. Every instinct that had kept her alive for the past 18 months told her to back through that door and disappear into the dark Arizona night. But her horse was lame, her canteen was dry, and the men who wanted her dead were no more than 6 hours behind her. "My name," she said, and she heard her own voice go flat and cold the way it did when she was cornered, "is Trouble." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. Something quieter than that. Something that looked uncomfortably like recognition. He stood up slowly, both hands still visible, and walked around the desk with the measured pace of a man who understood that sudden movements got people killed. He stopped 5 feet away from her, close enough that she could see the faint scar along his left jaw and the particular shade of his eyes, which were not quite brown and not quite black but something in between, like dark river water. He looked at the gun in her hand, then at her face, and then something happened in the corner of his mouth that might, in a kinder light, have been called a smile. He said, "You finally found the right man." The words hit her somewhere unguarded. She had not expected that. She had expected a lunge, a threat, a negotiation about the reward money. She had spent 18 months expecting the worst from every person she met, and the worst had reliably arrived, and she had survived it. She did not know what to do with a man who looked at her gun and said something like that. The hammer of the Colt was still pulled back. Her finger was still on the trigger. He just watched her, waiting, not afraid. Slowly, with a carefulness that cost her something she could not name, Anna Rhodes lowered her gun. It had begun, as most catastrophic things in her life had begun, with a man she trusted. His name had been Gerald Prout, and in the autumn of 1881 he had been the most respected banker in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Anna had worked for him as a bookkeeper for 3 years, having come to the territory from Missouri after the death of her parents left her the sole support of exactly no one and the sole keeper of her own fate. She was good with numbers. She was better with secrets, meaning she knew how to keep them, which made her valuable to a man who had many. She had been 24 years old, and she had believed, in the uncomplicated way of someone who had not yet been fully educated by the world, that honesty was a kind of protection. Gerald Prout had been stealing from his own bank for 2 years before Anna discovered it. The method was elegant in the way of crimes designed by intelligent and careful men. Small withdrawals logged against legitimate expenses. A second set of accounts kept in a cipher she had not recognized until the day she found the ledger he had left in his desk by accident. She sat with that ledger for a long time, turning pages in the quiet of the closed office on a Tuesday afternoon, while the October sun slanted through dusty windows, and she understood two things simultaneously. The first was that Gerald Prout was robbing depositors, many of them ranchers and shop owners who could not afford to lose what they had placed in his trust. The second was that she had just become very dangerous to a very dangerous man. She had gone to the sheriff of Santa Fe. His name was Walt Cruz, and he had been taking money from Prout for longer than Anna had worked at the bank. She had not known that. By the time she understood the shape of the trap she had walked into, Prout had already reported the ledger missing and accused her of theft. Cruz had a warrant drawn up before sundown. Anna ran with the ledger, a change of clothes, $42, and the Colt she had carried since leaving Missouri, because her father had insisted on it and had been, in that particular respect, entirely right. That had been 18 months ago. The territory was large, but a woman traveling alone with a price on her head was not invisible, and Prout's reach was longer than Santa Fe. He had connections in Albuquerque, in Tucson, in El Paso. He had hired men, real trackers with a talent for the work, and they had been behind her for most of those 18 months, close enough to keep her moving, never quite close enough to catch her. Until now. She had ridden into Redemption Creek because she was out of choices, which was the only honest way to explain it. The town sat in a hollow between two mesas in the southeastern corner of the Arizona Territory, 60 miles from the New Mexico border, and it was just large enough to have a marshal, and just isolated enough that Prout's network of purchased lawmen had perhaps not yet reached it. That was what she told herself when she pushed her limping horse through the dark on the road into town. It was the kind of reasoning that desperate people use, which is to say it was mostly hope dressed up as logic. She had not planned to walk into the marshal's office. She had planned to find the livery, see to her horse, locate a place to sleep, and be gone before dawn. But the lamp had been burning in the window of the office, and through that window she had seen the wanted poster on the desk, and something in her had cracked open with a tiredness so deep it went past the physical, past even the fear, down to some bedrock layer of herself that simply could not carry the weight any further. She had gone in because some part of her had needed to face it. Now she sat in the chair across from David Sawyer's desk, her Colt holstered, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that he had poured without asking, and she was telling him things she had not told anyone. She laid it out in order, the way she had organized accounts, methodically, starting with the ledger and ending with the 6 men she believed were between 12 and 18 hours behind her based on the tracks she had seen outside of Yucca Flats 2 days prior. She watched his face while she talked. He was a good listener. He did not interrupt. He did not look skeptical in the performed way of men who have already made up their minds. He looked like someone doing the actual work of listening, which was rarer than it should have been. When she finished, the office was quiet except for the wind outside and the small sound of the oil lamp. "You still have the ledger?" he asked. She reached into the inner pocket of her riding jacket and set it on the desk between them. It was battered and swollen from weather and handling, but the pages inside were intact because she had wrapped them in oilcloth on day 3 of running and never unwrapped them except to confirm they were still there. He opened it carefully. His eyes moved down the columns. She watched the lines of his face and saw the moment he understood what he was looking at, because something sharpened there, quiet and precise. "This is genuine," he said, "not a question. Yes, Prout is still operating. As of 4 months ago, when I was close enough to Santa Fe to hear news, yes. He has friends in the territorial government. The accusations against me made him sympathetic, A hardworking banker robbed by his own bookkeeper. She said it without bitterness. She had burned the bitterness out of herself in the first 6 months. What was left was cleaner and colder. He hired the best trackers he could find. One of them is a man named Cal Dunmore. If you know the name, you know what I'm dealing with. David's expression shifted just slightly. He knew the name. Cal Dunmore was a tracker and enforcer who had been moving through the southwestern territories since approximately 1878, appearing in the aftermath of various ugly situations, as the man hired to ensure that ugly situations reached their intended conclusion. He was not wanted, technically, because the men who hired him were careful about technical matters. He was known in the way that dangerous weather is known, by its effects more than its face. How many men does he have with him? David asked. When I last had a count, 5, could be more. He was quiet for a moment, turning pages in the ledger without really reading them now, thinking. The lamplight moved shadows across his face, and she found herself watching him in a way she had not permitted herself to watch anyone in a long time, noticing things. The steadiness of his hands, the way he held his shoulders, the particular quality of his silence, which was not empty but full, the silence of someone whose thoughts had weight. Why didn't you go to a federal marshal? He asked. If Prout has the county sheriff in his pocket, there are still federal authorities. I tried. 18 months ago in Albuquerque. The man I spoke to sent word ahead of me. I was nearly caught in Bernalillo 2 days later. She paused. After that, I was careful about who I trusted with the information. The answer, it turned out, was no one. He set the ledger down and looked at her across the desk. In the lamplight, she could see that what she had taken for calmness was something more complicated than that. There was history in his face, the kind of history that comes from having been in bad situations and come out the other side changed. She recognized it because she carried it herself. Why come here? He asked. To a marshal's office. Of all the places you could have gone in Redemption Creek. She had been asking herself that question since she walked through the door. The truest answer was one she was not ready to give out loud, which was that she had been so alone for so long that the risk of trusting someone, even wrongly, had started to feel worth the cost. What she said instead was, "Your reputation." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "What reputation?" I was told in a town called Cartwright's Crossing about 3 months ago that the Marshal of Redemption Creek was the only lawman in the southeastern territory who had never been purchased. The woman who told me had reason to know. Her husband tried to bribe you and you put him in a cell instead. Something moved across his face at that, not pride, something quieter. Hattie Beaumont, he said. She didn't give me her name. Doesn't matter, I know who you mean. He was quiet again. Then with a directness that she was not ready for. You're exhausted, your horse is lame, those men are coming, and you've been carrying this alone for 18 months. That's an accurate summary, she said. Here's what I'm going to do, he said. I'm going to send word to Judge Emmett Haas in Tucson, who is the one federal circuit judge I would stake my life on being honest. I'm going to send it tonight, by my fastest rider, with a copy of key pages from that ledger. In the meantime, you are going to sleep in the jailhouse, not as a prisoner, as a protected person, because it is the most defensible room in this building, and because if Dunmore arrives before Haas responds, I need you where I can keep you safe. She stared at him. And your horse, he added, will be seen to by my deputy, who has a talent with animals. Anna Rhodes had not cried in 18 months. She had come close, in dark camp hours when the fire was low and the stars were indifferent, but she had not let it happen because she had been afraid that if she started she would not be able to stop, and she needed to be functional, needed to keep moving. She did not cry now either. But something shifted, something deep and structural, like a load-bearing wall that had been under pressure for a very long time, slowly, cautiously accepting that it was not alone in holding the roof up. You don't know me, she said. You have no reason to believe me over a wanted poster. No, he agreed. But I've read enough fraudulent accusations in my career to know the shape of them, and I've read your ledger, and I know who Cal Dunmore works for and who he doesn't, and I know what it looks like when someone has been running scared versus running guilty. He paused. Those are different things if you pay attention. You've been running scared." She did not say anything. He stood up and took a ring of keys from the hook by the door that led to the cells in the back of the building. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you where you'll sleep." She followed him, not because she trusted him completely, not yet, but because something in her recognized something in him, and because the alternative was walking back out into the dark with nowhere to go. The cell he unlocked for her was clean. That was the first thing she noticed. Clean swept floor, a cot with a proper blanket, a small window that was too narrow to shoot through but let in enough air to breathe. He left the cell door open, conspicuously, and hung the ring of keys on a nail just inside the main room where she could see them from her cot. "The door at the end of the hall locks from the inside," he said. "There's a rifle on the rack in the main room, already loaded. If anyone comes through that door who isn't me, you are within your rights." "What about you?" she asked, and was surprised to hear something almost like concern in her own voice. "I'll be across the street," he said. "My house is directly opposite. If anything moves in the night, I'll see it." He started back toward the front, then stopped in the doorway and looked back at her over his shoulder. "I'll have Mrs. Caldwell bring breakfast in the morning. She cooks for the jail. She'll knock first." And then he was gone, and Anna was alone with the clean smell of swept floors and the first real sense of something approaching safety that she had felt in what seemed like another lifetime. She did not expect to sleep. She lay on the cot with the Colt on her chest and listened to the night sounds of Redemption Creek settling around her. And somewhere between counting her own slow breaths and watching the moonlight move across the narrow window, sleep took her quietly, like a patient thing that had been waiting for the right moment. She woke to sunlight and the smell of coffee and the sound of a woman's voice in the outer room. Mrs. Caldwell was a small, efficient woman of about 50 with iron-gray hair and the manner of someone who had seen enough of the world's irregular business that very little surprised her anymore. She set down a tray with biscuits, salt pork, and a full pot of coffee without asking any questions about Anna's presence in the jail's back room, which Anna found deeply restful. David came in 20 minutes later, hat in hand, looking like a man who had not slept much. He poured himself coffee and sat on the edge of his desk and told her that he had sent his deputy, a young man named Theodore Hale, out before midnight with copies of 2 pages from the ledger, the most damning pages that showed Prout's cipher and the corresponding real accounts, wrapped and addressed to Judge Haas's office in Tucson with a letter in David's own hand. "Theodore is my best writer," he said. "He'll make good time." "How long for a response?" "If Haas is in Tucson and acts immediately, 3 days, more likely 4. Dunmore could be here tonight," she said. "Yes." The word landed without drama. He said it the way he said most things, directly, without dressing it in either false comfort or unnecessary alarm. "Then we have a problem," she said. "Then we need to be ready," he said, which was a different framing. He spent the morning with her going over what she knew about Dunmore's methods. She told him about Yucca Flats and about a town 2 weeks before that called Serrano Wells, where Dunmore's men had waited for her at the livery rather than the hotel because they had understood how she moved. She told him about the one time she had seen Dunmore himself, at a distance of about 200 yards, a big man on a gray horse who moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never yet lost his quarry. David listened and asked precise questions. How many horses? What kind of guns had she seen? Did they have a wagon or were they all mounted? Were any of them local to the Arizona territory or were they all imported by Prout? She answered everything she could. She noticed, as she talked, that the tiredness was shifting inside her. Not gone, but changing quality. It had been the exhausted tiredness of someone fighting alone. Now it was becoming something more like the productive tiredness of someone who had been working hard at something that might actually succeed. Redemption Creek had, besides David, 2 sworn deputies. Theodore, who was currently riding hard toward Tucson, and a heavy-set, good-natured man named Carl Briggs, who David trusted absolutely. There was also, David mentioned, A man named Isaac Flores who ran the general store and had once been a Texas Ranger and who would, if asked properly, be willing to assist. That's 4, Anna said. Against potentially 6. Numbers aren't everything, David said. We know they're coming and they think you're still running. That's a significant advantage. She looked at him across the desk and felt the strange, slightly unnerving sensation of being genuinely seen by someone, not the way bounty hunters looked at her, measuring the $800 distance between her face and her worth, but in the way of someone who was looking at a person. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. Why are you doing this?" "The ledger is evidence and I'm a credible witness. I understand the legal angle, but you could just as easily hand me over and collect the reward and send the ledger to Haas yourself." He was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I had a sister," he said finally, and the past tense landed with its full weight. "Her name was Clara. She was accused of something she didn't do by a man with the right connections. She ran. She was alone." He stopped. "I was a farmhand in Texas then. By the time I knew what was happening and could get to her, it was too late." He set the cup down. "I became a marshal because I had to do something with what that left in me. And I have been waiting for the chance to do better than I did for Clara." He looked at her steadily. "This is the chance." The room was very quiet. Anna felt something move through her chest, tender and sharp at the same time, like a scar being pressed that was not entirely healed. "I'm sorry about your sister," she said, and meant it in the complete and undecorated way. "Thank you," he said, equally undecorated. They looked at each other across the desk in the morning light with the coffee going cold between them, and something happened in that look that neither of them named, because it was too new and the situation was too dangerous, and neither of them was the kind of person who named things before they were certain of them. But it was there, real and growing, like the first green thing after a long drought. He spent the afternoon making preparations with Carl while Anna stayed inside and rested her horse, a buckskin mare she called Pepper, who was being cared for at the livery by a boy named Marcus who apparently had a natural gift with animals. She used the time to go through the ledger one more time methodically, making a list of every transaction, every date, every figure, a clean summary that could be read quickly by a judge who did not have time to parse cipher. She had been a bookkeeper. This was what she did. When David came back in the late afternoon, she handed him the summary pages she had written in her neat, legible hand. He read them standing up, still in his hat and coat. When he finished, he looked up with an expression she could not immediately categorize. "This is thorough," he said. "I was good at my job," she said. "That's the irony of the whole thing. Prout hired me because I was meticulous and honest, and then being meticulous and honest is what brought me here." The corner of his mouth moved in that way it sometimes did, the almost smile. "It brought you to the right place," he said. There it was again. That quality in him, that way of saying things that cut through the careful distance she maintained around herself and landed somewhere warmer. She looked away and organized the remaining pages of her notes. "Dunmore hasn't come in yet," he said. "I had Carl ride out 2 miles east on the Yucca Flats Road. No sign yet." "It could still be tonight," she said. "It could, or tomorrow morning." He sat down and picked up his own coffee cup and found it empty and set it back down. "I want to go over the positions again. I've spoken to Isaac and he's with us. His store has a clear sightline to the main road coming in from the east. If Dunmore comes in by the road, Isaac will see him first. And if they don't come by the road, then we deal with it." The simplicity of this, the frank acknowledgement that plans did not cover every circumstance and you dealt with what came, was something she recognized from her own 18 months of surviving in improvised circumstances. It was, she thought, what competence looked like in practice. "Tell me something," she said, and the question came out before she had fully decided to ask it. "The reputation you have, the one that got me here, it's not common for a marshal in a small territory posting to be known the way you're known. What is it about you that made Hattie Beaumont think to tell a stranger about the Marshal of Redemption Creek?" He considered the question seriously, which she was coming to expect from him, the seriousness with which he took questions. "I think," he said slowly, "it's because people know I mean what I say. I said I would enforce the law impartially when I took this position, and I have done that even when it was expensive." He paused. Howard Beaumont had powerful friends. Taking his bribe offer and locking him up instead cost me politically. But it was the right thing, and people who watch carefully notice when someone does the right thing when it costs something. "Do you ever regret it?" "No." The answer was immediate and complete. She believed him entirely, without reservation, and the experience of believing someone that completely was so unfamiliar that it felt almost physical, a loosening somewhere in her chest. The night passed without incident. She slept better the second night, still with the cold, but more deeply, the sleep of someone who had, tentatively, lowered the very highest level of alert. In the morning there was breakfast again, and David, and the particular rhythm of his company, which she was already beginning to organize herself around without quite deciding to. They talked through the morning. Not about Dunmore or the ledger or the preparations, but about other things, things that were not directly urgent. His years in Texas, his path to becoming a lawman, her parents and the bookkeeping work she had fallen into and found, to her surprise, genuinely satisfying. The look of Missouri in autumn, which she described because he asked. The specific quality of silence in the desert at night, which he described because she asked. The conversation moved between them with the ease of something that had been waiting for the right conditions to grow. She found out in this way that he was 31 years old to her 26. That he had been the marshal of Redemption Creek for 3 years. That he had a vegetable garden behind his house that he tended himself on Sunday mornings, which she found improbably charming. That he read, actually read, books, and had a shelf of them in his house that he was mildly embarrassed to mention. That he took his coffee without sugar and his obligations without complaint and his risks without theatrics, and that all of these were consistent expressions of the same character. She found, which was more alarming, that she wanted to keep learning things about him. That she caught herself, in the pauses between conversations, thinking about the next thing she might ask. This was not the time for that kind of thinking. She knew it. She organized her thoughts firmly in the direction of survival and strategy. Carl Briggs came in mid-morning with news that 2 riders had been seen by a rancher named Pete Alderman on the eastern road, moving slowly, which suggested scouting. Not the full group. Scouts. David's expression did not change, but he stood up immediately. "Tell Isaac to keep his position. Tell him if either rider comes into town and goes for the livery, he's to come find me first." He looked at Anna. "Stay here." "I'm not staying here," she said. They looked at each other. He had, she suspected, the kind of face that was effective in standoffs. She had, she knew, the kind of face that was equally effective. "Then stay with me," he said, which was a different statement and one she found she could agree to. Carl looked between them with the expression of a man who was professionally obligated not to comment. The 2 riders came into Redemption Creek around noon, riding casual and slow the way scouts rode when they were trying not to look like scouts. They were unremarkable men in dusty trail clothes, and they were very good at looking like drifters, which meant they were professionals. David watched them from the window of his office without moving the curtain more than a fraction of an inch, and Anna watched from beside him, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his shoulder 3 inches from hers. "The one on the left," she said quietly. "I've seen him before. He was in Serrano Wells." "Good," David said. "Now I know what I'm looking for." He sent Carl to trail them at a distance. The scouts spent about 40 minutes in town, stopping at the saloon for drinks they barely touched, asking the barkeeper a few casual questions, and then riding back east at the same unhurried pace. Which meant the main group would come tonight or early tomorrow, having received a report that the town was quiet and unaware. That afternoon, David, Carl, and Isaac put their preparation into final order. Anna was part of the planning, not set aside or managed, but consulted, because she knew Dunmore's methods better than any of them, and David was not the kind of man who set aside useful information because of where it came from. She laid out what she knew about how Dunmore typically approached a situation, the preference for surrounding a position rather than frontal entry, the way his men used noise and distraction, and watched David and the others adjust accordingly. She was afraid, underneath all of it. She had been afraid for so long that she had a specific relationship with her own fear, a working knowledge of how it felt and how to function inside it. But this fear was different from the fear of the past 18 months. It was not the fear of someone alone. It was the fear of someone who had something to lose again, which was larger in some ways and smaller in others. Just before sunset, David came back to the office where Anna was waiting, and he stood for a moment looking at her in the fading light. And she had the sense that he was going to say something carefully, something he had been considering. "After this is over," he said, "and Judge Haas has the ledger and Prout's crimes are on record, what do you plan to do?" She had not let herself plan that far. She had been so focused on surviving the immediate future that the concept of an afterward had remained a kind of abstract country, theoretically possible but not real enough to map. "I haven't decided," she said honestly. "Redemption Creek could use a bookkeeper," he said. "The mining company's been asking for 2 years, and the bank that opened last spring has been running on the owner's wife doing the books, and she said several times she'd like to stop." She looked at him. He held her gaze with the directness that was entirely characteristic of him. "That sounds," she said, feeling her way through the sentence carefully, "like a practical observation." "It is," he said. "It's also something else." He paused. "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean or suggests things he hasn't thought about seriously." The evening light was going golden and long in the window behind him, and there was a quality to the moment that she was aware of as it was happening, the kind of moment that you know, even while you are in it, that you will remember. "I know," she said. "I believe that about you." "Then I'll leave it there for now," he said, "because tonight isn't the right time for anything more, but I wanted you to know." "I know," she said again, and this time it meant something different and they both understood it. He went out to take his position. She sat in the darkened office with the Colt on the desk in front of her, and listened to the town go quiet around her. And she thought about the particular grace of being understood by someone, after so long of being either invisible or hunted. And she thought it was the most startling and beautiful thing that had happened to her in as long as she could remember. Dunmore came at 2 in the morning. Not by the eastern road, which David had anticipated as a possibility. They came from the south, 4 of them on foot, having left their horses half a mile back, moving through the dark between buildings with the silence of experienced men. The other 2 went to the livery, because they always went to the livery, because the logic of a fleeing woman always included her horse. But Redemption Creek was not an unprepared town in the small hours, and the men moving through it in the dark found themselves in a very different situation than they had planned for. Carl took the 2 at the livery. He was waiting in the hayloft above with the patience of a man who had done a great deal of waiting in his professional life, and when they came in through the wide door below him, he called down clearly that they were under arrest and that he had a shotgun, and they, being professionals and therefore not suicidal, assessed the situation correctly and surrendered. 2 more came around the back of the marshal's office and met Isaac Flores, who was a former Texas Ranger and had positioned himself exactly where David had asked him to. And Isaac was persuasive in the specific way of a large and capable man who is entirely calm, and those 2 were also no longer in the fight. Dunmore himself came through the front door of the marshal's office. He was exactly as Anna had described, big, gray-coated, with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never yet failed at what he was hired to do. He came through the door with his gun already out and swept the dark room with the efficiency of someone who knew what he was doing. What he had not expected was that the room contained both Anna Rhodes and a marshal who had been sitting perfectly still in the shadows to the right of the door for the past 40 minutes, positioned specifically there, because David had thought through exactly this entrance. "Drop the gun," David said from the shadows. The voice came from the wrong place. Dunmore turned a fraction of a second too slow. Anna had the Colt up and leveled before Dunmore completed his turn. She was standing behind the desk, 18 months of fear and running and loneliness and desperate hoping all compressed down into the steadiness of her arms and the clarity of her aim. "I would do as he says," she told Cal Dunmore, and her voice was perfectly, completely steady. Dunmore looked at her for a long moment in the dark room, evaluating. He was a professional. Professionals calculated odds. The gun hit the floor. David was on him before the clatter finished, and Dunmore, for all his physical size and reputation, was wearing handcuffs before he had fully processed the speed of it. Anna set the Colt down on the desk with hands that were shaking slightly now that it was over, the way her hands had never shaken during but always after, and she breathed in and breathed out and looked at Dunmore in irons in the lamplight and felt something enormous and long-held begin to release inside her. "The others?" she asked. "Carl has two," David said, settling Dunmore into the chair by the wall. "Isaac has two." He looked at her. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. And then, after a moment, with a sudden surprised certainty, "Yes, I actually am." The sixth man, the one they had not accounted for, tried to take a shot through the office window from the alley beside the building and missed, because David moved Anna sideways in the same instant he heard the window glass crack, a single fluid move that put himself between her and the window, and Carl, who had secured his two and come running at the sound, found the man in the alley, and that was that. By 3 in the morning, 6 men were in custody in and around the Redemption Creek jail, which was considerably more than the jail was designed for, but Carl turned out to be resourceful with rope and the back storeroom. David and Anna sat outside on the steps of the office in the dark after it was over, and the stars over the Arizona territory were extraordinary, the kind of vast and indifferent beauty that the desert offers freely to anyone willing to be in it at 3 in the morning. She was still feeling the residual tremor of the adrenaline and the enormous, slowly expanding feeling of something ending that should have ended long ago. "Theodore should have made Tucson by now," David said. "Yes," she said, "if everything went right. Theodore is very reliable," he said. They sat quietly for a moment. The night air was cool and smelled of dust and sage. "You put yourself between me and the window," she said. "Yes." "That was not nothing." "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." She turned and looked at him in the starlight. He was looking at the stars, not at her, giving her the space to look, which was exactly the right thing in ways she could not have articulated. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like to stay in Redemption Creek." He turned and looked at her then. The expression on his face was the controlled, careful expression of someone receiving something very important with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm glad," he said. "For practical reasons," she added. "The bookkeeping positions you mentioned." "Of course," he said, and this time the corner of his mouth moved fully into a smile, unhurried and genuine, and she found it was one of the best things she had seen in a very long time. "And other reasons," she said. "I know," he said. They sat on the steps under the Arizona stars, while Redemption Creek slept around them, and the long, difficult thing that had been Anna Rhodes's last 18 months lay behind her like country she had finally traveled through, and in front of her was the particular open feeling of a road not yet taken. Theodore Hale returned from Tucson on the 4th day with a letter bearing Judge Emmett Haas's official seal. Haas had received the ledger copies and David's letter, and had, with an efficiency that reflected the seriousness with which he took the evidence, dispatched a federal deputy and composed a warrant for the arrest of Gerald Pruitt and Sheriff Walt Cruz of Santa Fe. The letter also officially suspended the warrant for Anna Rhodes pending full review of the case, which was legal language for "You are no longer a wanted woman." Anna read the letter 3 times in the office while David watched her with the particular stillness he had. "It's done," she said. The words came out smaller than she expected, simple and enormous at the same time. "Almost," he said. "Haas will want your testimony and the full ledger. We'll need to take it to Tucson." "Yes." She looked up. "We." "I'll escort you," he said. "It's a 4-day ride and you've been running alone for a year and a half. I'm not sending you to give testimony against a corrupt banker and his purchased sheriff without someone at your back." She looked at him for a moment. "You know," she said, "most people, when they say they'll keep someone safe, they do it in a way that makes you feel managed. And you don't," she said. "You make me feel like a partner." Something in him settled quietly, visibly, like something that had been holding tension, letting it go. They rode to Tucson together, she and David. 2 days after Cal Dunmore and his men were transferred to federal custody, through a process David navigated with the methodical competence that characterized everything he did. The ride was 4 days through country that was hard and beautiful in equal measure, red rock and desert scrub and wide sky, and they talked through all of it, the miles passing in the way miles do when you are in good company, faster and fuller than they have any right to be. She told him about her father, who had been a farmer and an amateur mathematician, and had taught her to love numbers as patterns, as stories told in a different language. He told her about his early years as a deputy in a small Texas county, the specific education of learning to read people under pressure, the mentor who had taught him that the law was a tool, and tools were only as good as the hand that held them. They argued once about the best route through a particular stretch of canyon, and discovered that they were both right from different angles, and the argument was therefore deeply satisfying to both of them. The second night out, they made camp beside a spring, and the fire between them was small and warm, and the horses were settled, and there was a particular quality of peace in that camp that Anna, with all her careful internal honesty, admitted to herself was not just the peace of safety. It was the peace of being with this specific person, in this specific firelight, and it was more comfortable and more complicated than she had expected love to feel. She had not used that word to herself before. She tested it now, quietly in the back of her thoughts, and found it fit. On the 3rd day, riding through open country with the mountains in the distance, David said without preamble, "I'd like to court you properly once this is settled in Tucson and you're safe to stay." The sky above was the color of blue glass and completely cloudless. "What does that mean to you?" she asked. "Properly." "It means letting people know," he said. "It means coming to dinner if you have a place for dinner, or inviting you to mine. It means making my intentions clear and giving you time to decide what yours are." She considered this. "And if I decided they were the same as yours?" He looked at her sideways from under the brim of his hat. "Then we'd discuss that." "I'm telling you now," she said, "that they are." He was quiet for a long moment. The horses moved steadily beneath them. "Anna," he said, and his voice had the quality of something rare and careful. "David," she replied, matching it. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. And that was in the way of two people who already understood each other completely, exactly enough. Tucson in the autumn of 1882 was a growing city of several thousand people, with a federal courthouse that sat solid and serious on a street of new-built offices. Judge Emmett Haas was a man of perhaps 60, with a gray beard, and the specific gravity of someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time, without becoming cynical about it. He received Anna and David in his chambers, reviewed the full ledger with 2 hours of complete focus, asked Anna a series of precise and unsparing questions about the circumstances of her employment and her discovery of Pruitt's fraud, and listened to her answers with the same attentiveness she had come to associate with David, and was now recognizing as a characteristic of people who were actually serious about the truth. At the end of the 2 hours, he told her that her account was consistent with the documentary evidence, that the warrant against her was being formally vacated as of that afternoon, and that federal warrants had already been dispatched to Santa Fe for Pruitt and Cruz. "Mr. Pruitt," he said dryly, "has apparently heard the noise coming his way and has attempted to flee south toward the Mexican border. He will be found." He was, as it turned out, found in El Paso 11 days later, which was information Anna would not receive for some weeks. But the receiving of it was one of the better moments of her life, clean and complete, the long account finally settled. She walked out of the federal courthouse in Tucson into the autumn sunlight, and David was waiting on the steps, hat in hand. And when she came out, she stopped 2 steps above him so they were at eye level, and she looked at him for a moment with everything in her face that she usually kept internal. He held his hat against his chest and looked back at her. "Done," she said. "Done," he confirmed. "I would like," she said, "to go home." The word settled between them, home. She had not had one of those in a year and a half. She watched him understand that she was using it to mean Redemption Creek, and watched what that understanding did to his expression, which was something profound and unguarded. "Then let's go home," he said. The ride back was different from the ride to Tucson. The urgency was gone, replaced by something more spacious. They took their time. They stopped when they wanted to stop. On the second evening, near a stream crossing where cottonwood trees grew yellow with the autumn, they sat beside the water for a long time after supper, and the conversation went quiet in a comfortable way, and eventually he took her hand, without particular ceremony, and held it, and she turned her hand in his and held back. It was not their first touch. They had been close in proximity and occasional contact for days, but this was chosen and declared, and it settled over her like warmth. She turned her head and looked at his profile in the early evening light, and thought about how 12 days ago she had walked into his office with a gun drawn and 18 months of fear and secrets and hard miles behind her, and told him her name was Trouble. She thought about what he had said. She thought he had been right. They came back to Redemption Creek on a Friday afternoon, and the town received them in the way of small towns everywhere, with a practical, collective awareness that something had been resolved. Carl greeted them at the marshal's office with the air of a man who had managed very well in David's absence and was quietly pleased about it. Mrs. Caldwell appeared within 20 minutes with food, which Anna was learning was her primary expression of good feeling toward the world. Anna spent the first week in Redemption Creek in a rented room at the boarding house, run by a widow named Mrs. Perez, a dignified woman of about 60 who ran a clean and orderly house and treated her tenants as rational adults capable of managing their own affairs. The room was small and had a window that looked onto the main street, and Anna sat in it the first morning and watched the town wake up and move around below her and felt, in a way she had not felt in a very long time, that she was in a place she was going to be. She took the bookkeeping position at the bank that same week. The owner, a man named Ford who had come to Arizona from Philadelphia with more ambition than experience, recognized good work when he saw her organization of his previous month's records and offered her a permanent position with a salary that was fair and terms she found acceptable. His wife, who had been managing the accounts, shook Anna's hand with transparent relief. The mining company's offer followed, and she negotiated to handle both sets of accounts, which was more work but was work she was good at, and that would give her a solid, independent income. This mattered to her. It had always mattered to her. She did not want to be a woman whose security was dependent on circumstances outside her control. Not again. David came to take her to dinner at the one restaurant in Redemption Creek, a place called the Copper Kettle run by a family named Torres, on the second Saturday after their return. He knocked on the front door of Mrs. Perez's boarding house with his hat in his hand, and Mrs. Perez let him in with the expression of a woman who approved. They sat at a corner table and ate roasted chicken and bread and talked for 3 hours. The restaurant around them ebbed and flowed, other diners coming and going, and they were barely aware of any of it. "Tell me what you want," he said, over coffee. "Not about the investigation or the position, about your life here. What do you want it to look like?" No one had asked her that in such a straightforward way. "Work I'm good at," she said. "A place of my own eventually, not a rented room." She paused. "People I trust." She looked at him. "I was not before Prout someone who had difficulty trusting. I don't want to stay someone who does. I want to find my way back to that." "I think you already have," he said. "Started to, anyway." "You make it easier than it should be," she said, and it was not quite a complaint but not quite a compliment, more like an honest observation. "I'm not complicated," he said. "I know what I think and I say it. I know what I want and I work toward it." He paused. "That's not wisdom, it's just how I'm built." "I like how you're built," she said, and then found herself suddenly interested in her coffee cup. He was quiet for a moment. When she looked up, he was watching her with that quality of warm attention that she was still not entirely accustomed to. "I'm going to take that as encouraging," he said. "It was meant that way," she said. They walked back to the boarding house through the quiet Friday night street, and he stopped at the front gate and they stood in the dark for a moment facing each other. "I told you I'd court you properly," he said. "I'm keeping to that." "I know," she said. "But I'd also like to tell you that the past 12 days have been the best 12 days I've had in a long time, and I don't think that's complicated to explain." She reached up and touched the edge of his jaw, the faint scar there, briefly and deliberately, with the very specific intention that they both understood. "Neither is this," she said. He covered her hand with his for one moment, then let her go gently, and she went inside and up to her room and stood at the window looking out at the town with something warm and expanding in her chest that she did not bother to name because she knew exactly what it was. The winter that came to Redemption Creek that year was mild by the standards of the territory, cold at night and clear most days, and Anna settled into the town the way she settled into most things that were right for her, steadily and without drama. She was good at her work and word got around, as it does in small places, and by December she had a third small account, the general store's books, which Isaac Flores was embarrassed to admit had been kept in a state of cheerful chaos for the better part of 2 years. She straightened them out in 2 weeks, and Isaac was so grateful he gave her a credit at the store that she used for practical supplies. And on one particular afternoon, a small bottle of good ink that she did not strictly need, but that was very pleasing to write with. She and David had dinner on Saturday evenings without it being formally declared, and lunches on Wednesdays when his schedule allowed, an occasional Sunday afternoon walks through the edge of town, where the land opened up, and the view was clear to the mesas. And in this way they came to know each other in all the small, ordinary dimensions that are more revealing than any single extraordinary event. She found that he was, in fact, an excellent cook, specifically of things that required patience, slow-cooked beans and braised meat and bread made from scratch on Sunday mornings, when he tended the garden and the house in a domestic rhythm that she found improbably and genuinely attractive. He found that she could be funny, specifically in a dry and precisely timed way that caught him off guard, and that she laughed at unexpected things and that her laugh was, in his private opinion, one of the better sounds the world contained. He found that she was still afraid, sometimes in the night, the residue of 18 months of being hunted, not something that simply stopped because the hunting had stopped. He found this out because on one particular Wednesday evening, they were walking back from supper later than usual and a horse in an alley moved suddenly, and she had her hand on her holster in a reflex before she recognized what it was, and she stood for a moment getting her breathing even, and then looked at him with a clear, unhidden look. "Still there sometimes," she said. "I know," he said. "It takes time." "I know it does," she paused. "It gets better, just not all at once." He fell into step beside her again, close enough that their arms touched, and walked her back to the boarding house. In January, a letter arrived from Judge Haas's office with the final disposition of the case. Gerald Pruitt had been arrested in El Paso and returned to Santa Fe, where he was currently awaiting trial on 14 counts of fraud and 3 of suborning corruption. Sheriff Walt Cruz had cooperated with federal authorities in exchange for reduced charges and was no longer in office. The warrant against Anna Rhodes had been formally and permanently vacated, and Haas expressed, in the courteous formal language of official correspondence, his appreciation for the quality and completeness of the documentary evidence she had preserved. She read this letter at her desk in the small office space she had rented beside the bank, with the good ink and a cup of tea going cold beside her, and she read it twice, and then folded it carefully and sat with it in her hands for a moment. Then she put on her coat and walked across the street to the marshal's office. David looked up when she came in. She held out the letter without saying anything. He read it standing up, hat and coat still on. He had just come in from something. He read it completely, then looked up. "It's over," she said. "Yes," he said. "It's genuinely, actually, finally over." "Yes," he said again. She crossed the room and he opened his arms and she walked into them and he held her, not cautiously or briefly, but completely and steadily, his arms around her and her face against his shoulder. And the long, difficult chapter of Anna Rhodes's life closed with the silent, specific completeness of a door that had been left open for too long, finally settling into its frame. They stood like that for a while. Outside, Redemption Creek went about its morning, commerce and weather and the ordinary human business of a small town, wholly indifferent to the fact that the woman in the marshal's arms had just set down 18 months of running and hiding and fear and endurance, and was, for the first time in a very long time, completely free. He asked her to marry him in March, on a Sunday morning, in the garden behind his house where the first things of spring were coming up, the green impossibly vivid against the dark soil. He did not make a production of it because he was not a man who made productions. He said that he loved her, that he had known it since Tucson and perhaps before, and that he wanted to build something with her here, in this place where she had come in with a gun and a secret, and had found, against all odds, the thing she had been looking for without knowing she was looking for it. He said that he understood if she needed time. He said that he was not going anywhere. She looked at him in the morning sunlight with the spring garden around them and the mesa in the distance and 14 months of knowing him layered into the foundation of her answer. "I don't need time," she said. "I've been thinking about this since October." He blinked. A real, unguarded blink of surprise which delighted her because he was very rarely unguarded. "Since October," he repeated. "Since the night we came back from Tucson," she clarified. "Since I stood at the window of Mrs. Perez's boarding house and looked at the street." She paused. "Yes. Yes to the question I just asked you. Yes to the question you just asked me," she confirmed. He stood there in his garden with his hands at his sides looking at her, and the expression on his face was so open and so unguarded, and so completely unlike the composed, steady face he presented to the world that she felt privileged to see it, the way you feel privileged to see something rare. "All right," he said, slightly unsteady. "All right," she said, entirely steady. He took her hands in both of his and they stood in the garden, and the morning was clear and warm, and around them the town of Redemption Creek went on, not knowing that the marshal and the woman who had walked in with a price on her head had just decided on their future. They married in June of 1883 in the small church that Redemption Creek had, with the Reverend Caldwell officiating. Mrs. Caldwell was his wife, a fact that made the catering of the reception deeply excellent, and Carl Briggs as David's witness, and unexpectedly warmly, Mrs. Perez as Anna's. Theodore Hale had returned from a posting in the eastern part of the territory specifically for the occasion, which touched both of them more than they said. Isaac Flores brought a wedding gift of such practical quality, a full set of matching account books in a style Anna had mentioned once in passing, that she suspected he had been paying closer attention than his cheerfully distracted demeanor suggested. The ceremony was simple and meant entirely. When Reverend Caldwell read the words and they said them back to each other in the quiet church in the June heat, Anna felt the sound of her own voice saying them and felt their truth all the way down. No performance in it, no uncertainty, just the clean weight of a commitment made freely and completely. She had moved into David's house the week before the wedding. the practical arrangement of the territory being such that waiting on convention was a courtesy most people paid less attention to than they might have further east. The house was comfortable and had been bachelor kept in the way of a man who was clean but not decorative, and they spent 2 evenings going through it together, deciding what changed and what stayed, which was one of the better evenings of Anna's life, the specific delight of being consulted about a space, of having it matter that she was there. She kept her account books. She kept her practice of Saturday morning organization, rising early when David was still sleeping and sitting at the small desk in what had become her office, running figures and reviewing ledgers in the particular clean satisfaction of work she was genuinely good at. He always knew she was there because of the sound of the pen and the particular silence she occupied when she was working, and he brought her coffee without interrupting her, set it down at her elbow, and went back to his Sunday bread or garden, and she drank it without looking up, and the two of them moved around each other in the house like people who had been practicing the same dance for longer than they had. By the following spring, Anna was carrying their first child, and the fact of this was something they received together in the manner of people to whom good things had come late enough that they knew to be grateful. She was 28 and he was 33, and neither of them had expected this life at this point, which made each part of it feel like something found rather than simply had. The pregnancy was a healthy one. She worked through most of it, the bookkeeping being sedentary enough that she saw no particular reason not to, and the small community of Redemption Creek watched over her with the slightly proprietary warmth that small communities extend to the people they have collectively decided they like. Mrs. Caldwell appeared with food at intervals. Carl Briggs made a point of checking in daily. Mrs. Perez sent a letter every 2 weeks from the boarding house 2 streets away, as though they were in different cities rather than the same small town. David was, as she had suspected he would be, exceptional about all of it. He did not fuss or hover or treat her as fragile. He was present and attentive and calm, which was what she actually needed. He read, privately, 2 books about obstetrics that he obtained from the doctor in Tucson through an exchange of mail that he conducted with some embarrassment, and never told her about the books, but she found them on the shelf one day and found the finding of them deeply endearing. She put them back in the exact position she had found them and never mentioned them. Their son was born in the late autumn of 1884, on a night when the wind came hard off the mesa and the house was warm and bright against it. He was healthy and loud about the fact, and he was named James, after David's father, with Rhodes as a middle name at Anna's request, because she wanted something of her own history carried forward. James Rhodes Sawyer came into the world in a good house on a night in November, and his father held him with the expression of a man who had not fully anticipated what that moment was going to feel like, which was to say completely undone in the best possible way, and his mother looked at them both with a love so comprehensive and structural that she knew it would be the foundation of everything that came after. She thought, in the quiet after, about the girl who had come to New Mexico territory with a talent for numbers and a belief in honesty, about the woman who had run for 18 months carrying a truth that no one would listen to, about the night she had walked into a marshal's office in the dark with a gun in her hand and told a stranger her name was Trouble. She thought about what he had said. She thought he had been exactly right. The years that settled into Redemption Creek around the Sawyer household were good ones, full of the kind of ordinary daily richness that looks like nothing from a distance and is everything up close. James was 2 when Anna discovered she was expecting again. This time they hoped for a girl, not out of disappointment. James was the delight of both their lives, but out of the natural human longing for variety and the desire to know both things. A daughter arrived the following spring, healthy and brown-haired, and possessed, from the earliest possible age, of a quality of focused attention that made both her parents look at each other with the slight alarmed recognition of people seeing their own traits reflected. They named her Clara, and David received this naming in the quiet room after the doctor had gone, and the house was settling into the soft sounds of a new baby and an evening, and he held his daughter and was still for a long time, and Anna watched him make peace with something old and beloved, and lost by letting it come forward into something new. "She would have liked you," he said finally. "I would have liked her," Anna said. He looked up. The lamp was warm and low. "I think," he said, "that she would have appreciated the symmetry of it. Two women who found the right man." Anna looked at him across the particular miracle of their daughter between his hands and thought about symmetry and about all the roads that had led here, the ones that hurt and the ones that opened, the ones she would not have chosen and the ones she was grateful for, and the way they had all somehow led to the same place. "She definitely would have," Anna said. The Arizona Territory became the state of Arizona eventually, in 1912, though that was beyond the particular horizon of this story. What was not beyond the horizon was the life that two people built in Redemption Creek in the years following that late night when a woman came in from the dark with a gun and a secret, and a name she called Trouble. David served as Marshal of Redemption Creek for 14 years in total, retiring in 1896 not because the work had broken him, but because he and Anna had by then established a life full enough that there were other things he wanted to do with the days. He served for some years afterward on the town council and was, without ever seeking it, the person most people in Redemption Creek brought their difficult problems to, because he was known to listen carefully and to say true things, and these qualities did not go out of fashion. Anna Rhodes Sawyer's bookkeeping practice grew, quietly and steadily, to be one of the most respected in the Southeastern Territory. She trained two young women as bookkeepers in her 30s, something that gave her a satisfaction she had not anticipated, the passing on of a skill she loved to people who needed it. She was known for clear accounts, scrupulous honesty, and the specific quality of being someone who could be trusted with information that needed to stay exactly where you put it. James grew up to be a serious, capable young man with his father's steadiness and his mother's talent for numbers, which was a combination that served him well. Clara grew up to be a person of such focused and determined intelligence that by the time she was 12, David had started bringing her problems from the council meetings to let her think about them, which she found entirely natural and which he found entirely correct. On a Saturday morning in October of 1893, Anna sat at her desk with the good ink and the account books in their ordered stack, and the particular early light of the desert coming through the window, and she could hear, from the kitchen below, David's voice telling James something about bread making with the patient specificity of someone who had been teaching the same lesson patiently for 2 years and was not yet tired of it. Clara was somewhere in the garden. She could hear the small sounds of her moving through it, and the house was warm and the work in front of her was satisfying, and the town outside was going about its morning. She had a particular habit in these still morning moments of taking a brief inventory of her life the way she took inventory of accounts, not the emotional inventory, though that existed too, but the factual one. Here is what is present, here is what is real, here is what you have. It was, every time she took it, an extraordinary account. She had come in with a gun and a secret and a year and a half of running. She had walked into an office where a man behind a desk looked at her weapon without flinching, and listened to her without agenda, and put himself between her and danger, not because it was his job, but because it was who he was. She had been told, in the plainest possible terms by the most straightforward man she had ever met, that her name was Trouble, and she was exactly where she needed to be. She picked up the good pen and opened the account book to the current page and began to work. And from the kitchen came the sound of her husband's voice and her son's laughter, and from the garden the particular quiet of her daughter thinking. And the October sun moved steadily across the wall, and Redemption Creek went on around the Sawyer house, ordinary and alive. And Anna Rhodes wrote her clear and careful numbers on the page, and was grateful. in the complete and unhurried way of someone who had found the right place and the right person and the right life for every single road that had led her here, even the hard ones, especially those. The ledger of Gerald Pruitt's crimes was entered into the federal record in Santa Fe and remained there. Pruitt was convicted in 1883 and sentenced to 12 years, serving 7 before dying of a heart condition in the territorial prison. Sheriff Walt Cruz, who had cooperated with authorities, lived out a quiet retirement in the eastern part of the territory, reportedly growing vegetables and avoiding all mention of his former employer. Cal Dunmore and his men were tried on charges of assault and conspiracy and served varying sentences, Dunmore himself receiving the longest for the attempted assault on the marshal's office, which Judge Haas took particular note of in sentencing. Theodore Hale eventually became a marshal himself, in a town 2 territories north, and sent Christmas letters to David and Anna for the rest of their lives. Carl Briggs served as deputy until he retired and then opened a hardware business that his daughter subsequently ran. Isaac Flores kept the general store until 1901, when his son took it over, and the accounts remained, thanks to Anna, impeccable. Mrs. Perez continued to run the boarding house until she was 73 years old, and then graciously accepted the room that Anna and David insisted on providing for her, in a house that had by then expanded to accommodate a family and had more space than any of them strictly needed, which was exactly how Anna had always, in her private heart, hoped to live. On evenings, in the years after the children were grown, and the house was sometimes just the 2 of them again, she and David sat on the porch that had been added to the back of the house in 1889, looking out toward the mesa, and the sky above it that was never the same 2 evenings in a row, and they talked, or were quiet in the equal ease of people who had long since made peace with all the available silences between them. She thought, sometimes on those evenings, of the specific moment in that dark office when she had lowered the gun, of the choice that had felt, in the instant of making it, like the most dangerous thing she had done in 18 months of dangerous things, the choice to trust, to stop running, to let something good be possible. She had told him her name was Trouble. He had said she had finally found the right man, and the whole long, beautiful rest of her life had been the proof of it. The sun went down over the Arizona mesa in colors that could not be adequately described, and Anna Sawyer watched it from her porch with her husband beside her, and the stars came up one by one the way they had come up on the night they sat on the steps of a marshal's office after the long danger was over, and everything was right and complete and good and done.